Hi everyone! This Prelude's theme consists of three elements: a series of repeated notes creating a tonic pedal, an embellished pentachord descent between the keys 5th and 1st degrees, and a three-note figure which introduces one or more accidentals not present in the theme's overall key. The pentachord descent is embellished with escape note figures, which along with their pentachord partners may, depending on context, function both as harmony and non-harmony notes. The pedal notes and pentachord descent are connected as a compound melody, which repeats this three-note motif combining a pedal note with the pentachord escape note pair. As the theme progresses with each repeat of the motif, the interval between the pedal notes and the pentachord descent increases, beginning here with a descending leap of a fourth for the initial motif and concluding with a seventh. In terms of contrapuntal terminology, this creates oblique motion between the repeated notes and the descending line. Only the pentachord's root note lacks a pedal note escape note pair, instead leaping to the scale's 3rd degree before returning by step to the 1st. Despite the compound melody creating a descending-ascending motion between the pedal and pentachord escape note pairs, the horizontal motion of these elements both compositionally and analytically is also very important. Bach, for example, sometimes treats the motion of the escape note figures in a standard way of being approached by step and then leaping to another note, while at other times their motion parallels that of the pentachord descent. In other words, while the motion of the pentachord descent is fairly constant, Bach varies as required the escape note figure's motion. Throughout the prelude, the theme, excluding the concluding three-note figure, is presented in only two keys, A minor and E minor, with the lowest note of the three-note figure beginning a major second above the root note of the A minor entries, and the perfect fourth above those in E minor. Sometimes the three-note figure is used as a pivot between the theme and another key, while at other times it's part of secondary harmony. Occasionally also, the chord harmonizing the pentachord's root note is included in the key of the three-note figure. In this way, the theme is sometimes modulating, and in two of this work's 4 thematic entries, a modulation is used. Except for the embellishment around the pentachord's root note, the theme is harmonically ambiguous. Is this, for example, second inversion A minor tonic harmony, or F submediant 7th harmony in 4/2 inversion? And is this D subdominant harmony? The structure of the theme and its lack of harmonic clarity, however, allows Bach to use it in a number of contexts to create intricate contrapuntal textures. In all of these settings, it's what Bach writes against the thematic entries, which either confirms the theme's key or changes it. In 3 of the work's 4 thematic entries, the overall key of the bars in which the entries are located match that of the theme. Only here does Bach use an E minor theme entry, but harmonizes it in the key of A minor. Other subtleties of the theme I'll discuss as they occur. The theme in the Prelude's initial bars is in the key of A minor and is presented in the treble played by the right hand. The theme's key is maintained by an arpeggiated A minor triad in the left hand, which has an F note between A minor's ascending 3rd and 5th degrees, while its concluding root note creates with the theme's three-note figure a B dominant 7th chord in 4/2 inversion. Several reasons why Bach may have chosen to add the F note to the A minor arpeggio are so that the concluding A note would vertically interact with the three-note figure, to avoid the descending 3rd and root notes sounding together in both hands, where here they move in 6ths, and perhaps the main reason, to insert this inverted motif with augmented note values. The notes of the inverted motif here interact with the pedal notes of the theme using the intervals 6, 3, and 4. And because there are 4 repeated notes in the pedal, as we'll see, Bach is able to move the motif's location while retaining these intervals or their inversions. Harmonically, the theme and lower part together create the already mentioned B dominant 7th chord, root position and inversions of A minor harmony, and the D minor subdominant 7th chord in 6/5 inversion. While the overall key of this entry is A minor, the dominant 7th chord harmonizing the 3-note figure may be heard as the dominant 7th of E minor, the key of the work's second thematic entry in bars 3 and 4. Beginning with this A minor entry, but used in all the thematic entries of this work, Bach appears to melodically treat the pentachord escape note combinations as a series of 3 interlocking cambiata figures, the notes of which, as already mentioned, are freely treated as harmony and non-harmony notes. The initial E note of the first cambiata, for example, may be heard as the 5th degree of the underlying A minor triad, with the F here treated as an escape note, but whose motion may be heard as forming a 4-3 suspension against the C harmony note in the left hand. The suspension's resolution is the cambiata's final E note, which is approached from below by this D. And while this D is a note of the pentachord descent, here it behaves as a non-harmony lower neighbour note between the cambiata's framing E's. The final D and E notes of the first cambiata figure are also the initial notes of the second cambiata. In this context, however, until the underlying harmony changes, they still function as harmony note and suspension resolution and lower neighbour note. With the change of harmony, the motion of the E escape note figure forms a 7-6 suspension against the F of the left hand, with the resolution occurring on the final D note. The motion of this cambiata's initial D also continues with the change of harmony as part of the pentachord descent, moving now as a harmony note to the C, the 7th degree of the subdominant 7th chord. With the third cambiata figure and the change of harmony back to A minor, the motion of this D note again forms a 7-6 suspension, which resolves here, while the motion of the cambiata's initial C note follows the pentachord descent to A. The initial C's motion, however, is also prolonged by the B pentachord note sounding as a lower neighbour note before the C is repeated through the first inversion A minor triad, where it's treated as a passing note over the bar's final B dominant 7th chord. Usage of the cambiata figures in this first thematic entry should in no way be considered a template for analysing the other entries, and while some elements do recur, Bach approaches each entry slightly differently. For the second thematic entry, Bach uses an E minor theme in the left hand, against which he places in the right hand the inverted motif beginning now on the theme's first dotted quarter note beat. The intervals between the inverted motif and the theme's pedal notes are now inverted, sounding 3, 6, and 5, and the inverted motif's note values have been halved, although their relative distances are the same as if they were dotted quarter notes. From the C note of the inverted motif, Bach uses a stepwise descent to this G, with the notes of the descent interacting using the intervals 6, 5, 4, and 3, with the pedal notes and the pentachord's root note. Against the motif and descent in the right hand, Bach uses compound melody to create a second line, which I'll discuss along with the theme entry. As with the first entry, Bach maintains the same key through to the end of the theme's pentachord descent, and as before, the 3-note figure is harmonized as a dominant 7th chord, here A dominant 7. Given the preceding B dominant 7th chord in bar 2, the interaction here on the first 8th note beat between the E pedal and first note of the inverted motif may be heard as tonic E minor harmony, after which the theme's first cambiata figure again sounds B dominant 7th harmony, with its 7th degree resounded here as the second note of the pentachord descent. Hearing these beats as B dominant 7th harmony means the C of the inverted motif sounds as an appoggiatura, though given consonant support by the E of the pedal. The motif C then moves to this B note, a note of the dominant, but here sounding as part of tonic E minor harmony. The C of the first cambiata behaves as an escape note, while above it in the right hand, Bach uses as part of the upper compound melody this E passing note moving to this F sharp, while this G sounds as an incomplete upper neighbour note prefix, also moving to the F sharp. An alternative hearing of these beats may give more importance to this voice exchange between the E and C notes, potentially suggesting submediant and or subdominant 7th harmony. The interaction as a second of the cambiata's initial B note with the C of the inverted motif occurring at the same location as the suspension of the first thematic entry might also suggest this cambiata's B to A descent should be heard as a 2-3 suspension. Despite the voice exchange and apparent suspension, however, I tend to prefer the first analysis, hearing these beats as B dominant 7th harmony. Reasons for this include: the notes of the apparent suspension are part of the theme's pentachord descent, which is now in the lowest part of the texture and is therefore heard more prominently, exerting greater influence on the underlying harmony. The descent's motion also is fixed, and the move from this B to A, with a return to the B, is a common figure for 7th chords in 4/2 inversion, where the 7th degree, as in this example, then resolves to the third of the following first inversion chord. In other words, just because two parts interact as an apparent suspension doesn't necessarily mean they should be heard as one, especially if other factors are present. Another reason I favour hearing these beats as B dominant 7th harmony is if these notes are to be considered as chords in their own right, they would only be prolonging the framing dominant, confirming that chord's presence. And finally, it must be remembered that pedal notes are not always considered part of the underlying harmony, and motivic usage also is often given more flexibility with its placement if the composer wishes to preserve the motif's shape. The fact that the motif C finds consonant support with the pedal, therefore, doesn't mean it should necessarily be heard as forming a chord. As already mentioned, on the final dotted quarter note beat of this bar, B dominant 7th degree, A resolves as a 2-3 suspension to the third of E minor harmony, with both notes occurring as part of the theme's second cambiata figure. Above the E minor chord's root note, which is also the theme's pedal, Bach suspends this F sharp note, sounding as a 9/8 suspension, which resolves over the second cambiata's final A note. This A behaves as an escape note, while E minor's 3rd degree, G, moves as a 2-3 suspension against the A of the right hand's descent to resolve to the third of the following D sharp leading note diminished harmony, all occurring as part of the theme's third cambiata figure. Unusually, this suspension's resolution is doubled, although perhaps Bach did so because the third of diminished chords are often doubled in thicker textures. The third cambiata figure's final note may be heard as an escape note and an anticipation of the third of the pentachord descent's concluding E minor triad, a triad which Bach prolongs using voice exchange between its root and 3rd degrees. This F sharp of the leading note chord also creates a 9/8 suspension over the concluding E minor triad. The theme's final A dominant 7th chord resolves to D minor harmony in bar 5, which uses essentially the same figures as bar 4 to sound a 2-5-7 progression in C major. Bach's inclusion in bar 5 of this figure as part of the key of the dominant 7th at the end of the bar may suggest we should also hear this as the supertonic of D minor and this as the subdominant of E minor. In both these instances, however, it's probably unlikely that we would hear the A minor triad as the subdominant of E minor and the E minor triad as the supertonic of D minor, as they will likely be heard together with the key of the preceding music. Both chords, however, may still be considered pivots into those keys. Leading into the third thematic entry in bars 6 and 7, the 2-5-7 progression in C major from bar 5 resolves as an interrupted cadence to the chord of A minor, C major's submediant, and the tonic of A minor, the key in which the prelude continues. Here Bach uses an E minor pentachord descent in the right hand, which is mostly harmonized in the key of A minor, except for these two beats, which are harmonized as part of A dominant 7th harmony, the dominant 7th of D minor. Once again, this E minor chord may be heard as the supertonic of D minor, and both it and the following A dominant 7th chord sound as a secondary 2-5-7 progression to A minor's subdominant in bar 8. While Bach doesn't use the inverted motif in this entry, he does take the 6-5-4-3 descent from the previous entry and reverses it, now sounding 3-4-5-6. He also moves its placement to begin on the first dotted quarter note beat of the theme. Bach again uses compound melody beneath this descending line. In this entry, however, the compound melody's lower line, except for those notes creating the 3-4-5-6 descent, simply double the theme's pentachord escape note pairs in thirds. The theme's initial cambiata figure begins with a non-harmony note, this B sounding as an incomplete lower neighbour note prefix to C, the third of the underlying A minor triad. The C then sounds over the B of the following E minor dominant harmony as a 9/8 suspension to resolve on the cambiata's concluding B note. As with the previous entry, this theme entry's second cambiata figure includes an apparent suspension, as this B of the cambiata sounds a 9th above the A of the 3-4-5-6 descent in the left hand. As before, there are several reasons which I think works against analysing this as a suspension. Perhaps the most prominent reason is the harmonisation of the theme entry in thirds, which creates another set of interlocking cambiata figures in the left hand, emphasising E minor's third and root note. This, along with the theme's pentachord escape note pairs, suggests that minor dominant chord is sounded through to the first dotted quarter note beat of the following bar, where this A of the theme's third cambiata does create a 9/8 suspension against the G of the left hand descent. The suspension's resolution, the cambiata's final G note, not only sounds the third of minor dominant harmony, but also prepares the 7th degree of the following secondary A dominant 7th chord. For the final thematic entry, Bach uses an A minor theme in the left hand and maintains that key throughout. Even the 3-note figure is harmonised as a secondary B dominant 7th chord to A minor's dominant in bar 15. The only change to this theme is the inclusion of the raised 3rd degree, which, as we'll see, Bach also harmonises as secondary harmony. Much like the E minor theme entry in bars 3 and 4, here Bach again uses the inverted motif beginning on the theme's first dotted quarter note beat, together with the 6-5-4-3 descent. Using compound melody, he also again creates a lower line beneath both these elements, which includes A minor's chromatic tetrachord. The initial note of the theme's first cambiata figure sounds as a 7th degree of F subdominant 7th harmony, a chord which is approached in the previous bar by A minor's dominant 7th, copying the lead into the third thematic entry, whose initial chord also began as part of an interrupted cadence. The F submediant 7th degree sounds as the initial note of the theme's pentachord descent, with the escape note sounding as the root note. The chord's 3rd degree A in the right hand begins the chromatic tetrachord descent, which then sounds the 5th of the following D minor chord, while the submediant 7th resolves as a 2-3 suspension to D minor's root note. The first cambiata's final D and E notes also sound as the initial notes of the theme's second cambiata, with the D note sounding both as the root note of D minor harmony and the 7th of the following E dominant 7th chord in 4/2 inversion. As before, the dominant 7th degree then resolves as a 2-3 suspension to the third of a secondary A dominant 7th chord, which then resolves to the root note of A minor's major subdominant, harmonising the chromatic tetrachord's F sharp note. The A secondary dominant 7th degree is approached as part of the chromatic tetrachord descent, moving from the 3rd degree of E dominant 7th harmony, while the E note of the inverted motif sounds the secondary chord's 5th degree. The secondary 7th chord's 3rd degree and the root note of the major subdominant then sound as the initial notes of the theme's final cambiata figure. Here, the interval of a second sounding between the C sharp and D of the upper line must once again be considered an apparent suspension, as the resolution to this B is not part of the D minor subdominant 7th harmony created when the chromatic tetrachord's descent moves from F sharp to F natural. In this instance, it's the D escape note's motion which moves to D minor 7th degree, sounding as the Cambiata's final note, while the B moves as a lower neighbour note. The D minor subdominant 7th degree is then sounded as the third of the following A minor triad and may be heard as resolving to the root note of the secondary B dominant 7th chord, a motion which copies that of the final C note of the first thematic entry, but in a different context. The conclusion of the chromatic tetrachord sounds as both an incomplete lower neighbour note suffix to the third of D minor subdominant harmony and as an anticipation of the fifth of the following A minor triad. I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.